Welcome back, Hnrs. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to our discussion of... Yeah, that's right. But even though, unfortunately, today in class we had to talk about one of the worst days ever, of course, when, you know what happened. Y'all know what happened, the Ides of March and stuff like that, and unfortunately, like what's going to happen to poor little Caesar is he's going to get stabbed in the back, right? So the big thing about it, though, is we spent all of class today talking about the rise of Caesar, his rise to prominence, his crossing the Rubicon, the creation of the triumvirate, of course, like getting like the worst Amazon Prime Day package ever, Pompey's head in a basket. Like, so the big thing about it, though, is we're now going to be moving into the time period that followed the death of Caesar, right? The end of the Republic and moving into the Empire period, and the creation of what you would actually refer to as an empire being led by what you would call an emperor, right? Rome moving back into what basically a monarchical style fashion, right? Where literally leaders would come along and they would be borderline hereditary, where they would select and choose the runners up and the actual next up in line every single time, right? Well, the big thing about it, though, is Julius Caesar did leave everlasting impacts on the society of the world, right? The Caesar Superdome is named after him. The calendar that we use now is literally created by him. Also, the month of July is named after him. The man literally left his mark on history in more ways than you would ever consider, and in ways that you interact with every single day, literally, with the calendar. But the big thing about it is we're now going to be moving into what is known as the Empire period, right? Now, we do have to talk about a little bit of setup first before we can really get into and or talk about the Empire period, right? So when you're looking at the Empire period, or something that you need to understand is what we're about to be getting into is the rise of Caesar's grandnephew, Octavian. The guy that, like Caitlin Strimlau always wants to bring up, right? Caitlin Strimlau always wants to just be like, oh, you mean Augustus Caesar? No, not him. The morally disputed one. No. Well, actually, in this sense, yes, we are now talking about Augustus. Sorry about that, Caitlin. That was really confusing. So the big thing about it, though, in general, is what we're now talking about and getting into is it's going to be a lot like the Caesar story. It's a very storyline-driven thing. And so there's going to be a lot of words on this Prezi. Do not write them all down. Cut through them. They're mostly there for me so I don't forget little kitschy stuff, right? So the big thing about it, though, is let's pick up right where we left off in class talking about the growth of the empire under this guy, right? That right there is the famous figure that we are about to be talking about. He is the next chapter in Roman history, and he's crazy important to the death of the Republic and the growth of the empire, right? And his name, before we go any further, is Octavian Caesar, right? Octavian. Octavian, okay? Octavian. Now, some of y'all are just like, wait a minute, I thought you just said it was Augustus. We'll get there, right? He changes his name later on. But the big thing about it, though, is I love this statue. I've seen this statue. It's actually in the Vatican City, right? It's very cool, all right? Now, the big thing about it, though, is Augustus right here, a.k.a. Octavian, known by both names, but at first is known as Octavian, is a very important figure in the death of the Republic and the growth of the empire, right? But something that you need to understand before we go any further is that after Julius dies, a civil war breaks out again, right? A massive civil war rages between pro-Julius Caesar armies and the Ottomans and anti-Julius Caesar armies known as the, pro-Julius armies are the Populares. The anti-Julius armies are the Ottomans, right? So going into it, though, the biggest one and the biggest funder of the anti-Julius armies was the Senate, right? The Senate supported Brutus and Cassius and their actions, and the entire time, Brutus and Cassius were like, oh, everyone in Rome is going to love us. They're going to think we're awesome for killing Caesar, but everybody hated their guts. So they actually ended up running away over to Greece, right? So they actually ended up running over to Greece to try and avoid the coming back of this guy, which is one of the most horrifying sculptures I've ever seen. But the big thing about it, though, is Octavian is his name, right? Octavian Caesar is going to be Julius Caesar's grandnephew, right? His grandnephew. Well, the big thing about it, though, when you're looking at the growth of his figure and who this guy is, he is the son of Caesar's sister, right? So looking at the growth of his figure and prowess, something you got to understand about Octavian before we go any further is where he was and what was going on when Julius was rising to power. Octavian was actually also over in Greece, studying, right? Octavian, something you need to know about him before we get started is he is phenomenally intelligent, right? Crazy smart, understands the stars and their movements, and he really loved astronomy, right? He also was a very good historian, and he was a very good studier, and he was very, very, very brilliant, right? Well, the big thing about it, though, is the Senate thought that this guy would be the best person to recruit for their cause. Now, somebody like Olivia is probably raising their hand being like, but wait a minute, Mr. Terry, I thought the Senate didn't like Caesar. They didn't. They actually viewed Octavian as a pushover, right? They thought Octavian would be a good guy to bring in here because he's now adopted by Caesar and his son and everything like that. But they basically thought he was like a nerd. And just to give you a heads up, Julius Caesar did adopt Octavian as his son, mostly for will reasons, right? As in the passing down of property reasons, right? So the biggest thing you need to understand is that in Rome, if you were dying without any sons, a lot of times Romans would adopt men as sons that are their nephews or their cousins or a relative, so their property would have someone to go to, right? So Caesar adopted Octavian, and so Octavian inherited all of Caesar's property, but he also inherited all of Caesar's debts. So to give you a heads up, Caesar actually had a ton of debt. He bribed a lot of people to get his way into power. He actually used the first triumvirate and all its access to try and pay off some of those debts, because remember, Crassus was like the richest man in all of Rome. But the big thing about it, though, is Octavian was viewed as a pushover, this guy that had just inherited a lot of debt and a lot of troubles from Caesar, but also as someone who wasn't there. And so the Senate was like, oh, we'll bring him back after the death of Julius, and we'll use Octavian to go off and destroy the person that is leading the pro-Julius armies. And the guy that's leading the pro-Julius armies is it's a very famous figure that we talked about at the crossing of the Rubicon, who's a very famous pleb, is none other than Mark Antony, right? But the Senate believed that Octavian would help them win this war, right? Because they thought their distant relationship between Caesar and Octavian would hinder his ability to identify with Julius's ideas. And he also thought that they also were like, he's a nerd. He's like this kid that was over in Greece the whole time that wasn't even here. I bet you we'll be able to manipulate him into going off and beating Mark Antony's armies in battle, right? But what they did not expect is that Octavian did go off and do this. He returned all the way from Greece. He went all the way to the Senate, and the Senate was like, we are going to give you several legions, Octavian, to go up and destroy the madman that actually was manipulating your uncle the whole time. This is what they said, even though it wasn't true. None other than Mark Antony, right? Mark Antony is to the north of Rome. He is above the Alps. He is preventing the growth of the Senate and the return of power to the Republic. Go up there, subdue his army, and return, right? Well, Octavian does march up there, and he marches against Mark Antony, and they have a very small battle. But at the end of this battle, after Octavian's forces actually lose, Octavian calls a meeting with Mark Antony. And he calls this meeting, and they actually get together, and they meet inside of one of the imperial tents. And they sit there together, and they're like, you know what, man? I think Julius had it right the whole time. I think the Senate is the true enemy of Rome, and I think their disgusting tentacles have actually killed the Republic and turned it into something disgusting, right? And so with that, though, Octavian and Mark Antony actually merge together. After they actually sat there and met with one another after that battle, they merged together and combined their forces and decided to march on Rome and take it over, right? Now, the interesting little thing here with this, though, is they have to figure out a way to subdue the Senate without even really fighting a battle, right? Octavian and Mark Antony still want to support the veterans. They still want to support the people that are underneath them, and they don't want their soldiers to have a loss of life against a pro-Senate army and a very, very large scuffle where they actually would even want to support the senator's army men as well, the veterans as well. So what they decide to do is Mark Antony and Octavian have a genius idea. And they're like, oh, well, why don't we take the 30% of the senators, the richest out of all of them, including guys that talk crap about Caesar this entire time, like this dude named Cicero, which I'm sure y'all actually read a bunch of his stuff in Latin if you are in Latin. So Cicero and other families like that, and we'll put their names on a hit list. And we'll tell the plebes and patricians of Rome that if you go off and find one of these senatorial families, then we'll give you 10% of everything they owned. These really rich families, right? If you go off and kill one of these senator families and bring their dead bodies back, we'll give you 10% of their estate, which is worth massive amounts of money. But then who gets the other 90%? Octavian or Mark Antony do. Why is Octavian using this? This demonstrates his intelligence. He's also going to use all that money to pay off all the debt that Julius left behind, right? So Octavian and Mark Antony march on Rome with this hit list of senatorial families, and it's the best fundraiser you've ever seen. It's better than selling Girl Scout cookies. People go out and start hunting down these other senators' families that hated Caesar and that now hate Octavian and were fighting against Mark Antony, right? And it's a genius way to take over, right? They do this, they march on Rome, they take it over, and they say, we need to create a more permanent power structure going forward to make sure that this doesn't happen to Rome ever again. And so Octavian, Caesar's grandnephew, as we already know, decides to form another political alliance that emulates the one that his uncle created, right? And that is going to be the second triumvirate. The first triumvirate, of course, was Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus. The second triumvirate, on the other hand, is going to be Octavian, Mark Antony, and Marcus Lepidus, right? Now, an important thing to understand about the difference, though, between the first triumvirate and the second triumvirate is its end game and goals, right? So check this out. The first triumvirate was all about trying to figure out a method and a way to gain power for the... So the thing about the difference between the two triumvirates is very important. The first triumvirate was all about the growth and power of Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar. Crassus using his money, Pompey using his political influence, and Caesar using his ability to rally the veterans and the plebes behind him, right? It was all about growing the individual's power in and of this sense, right? Well, the big thing you also need to understand about this is the second triumvirate is going to be very different. It's actually made up of the generals that supported Caesar and Octavian himself, right? So what those guys that are going to be in this triumvirate are known as is Octavian, Mark Antony, Marcus Lepidus, right? Marcus Lepidus is the guy that ran the navy, Mark Antony led most of the army, and Octavian was going to be the political figurehead, right? So at this time, when they actually set up this entire new empire, the big thing about it is that Rome spanned most of the Mediterranean, right? So Rome went all the way from here in southern Spain, all the way down through Italy. It also went all the way through here, out through Greece, all through Turkey, to the eastern side, and then it stopped, and then it went like this all the way over, right? Well, the thing about it is this little area right here in the middle, this chunk right there, is the only part of the Mediterranean that the Romans didn't own. And we'll get to that here in a big second, but it is important to know that the Kingdom of Egypt was not actually owned by the Romans whatsoever. So looking at this thing at the time, you have to understand what Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus are going to do. What they're going to do is they're going to divide the entire empire up into three different sections, right? What they decide to do is Mark Antony is going to get this area over here in the east, and he will be the dictator of that area of the empire. Octavian got this whole area of the both, of course, including the city of Rome, and then also its conquered areas in the west, and then Marcus Lepidus got this stuff right here, right? And they decided to chunk it up into a three-way dictatorship to give them the ability to rule over these different areas. Now, in reality, too, Mark Antony over here and Octavian over here were really the two people leading this triumvirate. Marcus Lepidus is borderline irrelevant. So it's more like a diumvirate, and Marcus Lepidus is just over here like, I got boats, right? But he's not really that important in the grand scheme of everything, right? But looking at it, though, they decided to try and break it up into a three-way dictatorship to bring peace back to the empire. Well, what's going to end up happening, though, is Octavian and his new buddies, after they do this, decide that they want to go off and curry favor with the people and hunt down the scumbags that killed Caesar, right? So after they created this three-way dictatorship in the second triumvirate, they decide to venture over into Greece, right? And find Brutus and Cassius. And they actually went out there and defeated them at a very famous battle known as the Battle of Philippi, right? Now, the funny thing about it is Cassius had an army and Brutus has an army. And, like, at the very one of the earliest battles, they actually lost. And, like, Augustus was nowhere, or Octavian, excuse me, was nowhere to be seen at the time. And it was very, very confusing, blah, blah, blah. But what ends up happening, though, is Brutus and Cassius realize they're about to lose. And they both kill themselves, right? Brutus actually has two soldiers hold his sword out like this. And he has to run into it and stuff like that, which is really, really funny. And then also, of course, like, Cassius ends up stabbing himself in the stomach and stuff like that. But in the long run, though, after this major victory and after Brutus and Cassius die, what Octavian decides to do is celebrate the growth and promise and proclamation of his dad becoming a god and his ascension with his buddies to the power of Rome, right? So they have a massive series of games in the Circus Maximus, right? To celebrate their win over Brutus and Cassius, the men that killed Caesar, right? And at this thing, it's actually a bunch of public executions of all the senatorial families that they were hunting down in the first place. That hit list of families, they killed a bunch of them that day and actually executed all of them in front of the people of Rome. It was absolutely crazy. And then at that moment during the games, Octavian told the crowd, stop! Stop what you're doing and watch as my father ascends into the heavens as a god, right? And everybody looked up, and all of a sudden, a comet was streaking across the sky. And everybody's like, oh my God, there goes Julius, right? The thing about it is remember, Octavian studied astronomy while he was in Greece. He knew that that comet was coming, and so he used this as a political advantage, right? Because now if his dad is a god, that means that Octavian is related to a god, right? And so, of course, when they move forward, they split up the empire into those three sections. Mark Antony getting this one over here, Octavian getting the big one that's really, really important, and Marcus Lepidus just being annoying over there down in North Africa, right? Well, the thing about it, though, what's going to end up going down is everything progresses pretty peacefully for a little while, until things got real, real sketchy and a little bit hairy there. Because after the death of Brutus and Cassius, the second triumvirate split the empire and they each ruled a third of it, right? And so I showed you on that map where that was. I got a little excited and I showed you the map a little bit earlier, all right? So, but the big thing about it is they each ruled 1/3 of a part of the empire, right? Now, looking at it, though, Lepidus got his lands and armies taken from him by Octavian. Because he's weak and kind of not really that important, right? And also a lot of it is due to the fact that he had to go off and fight, Octavian had to go off and fight this guy named Sixtus Pompey, who was actually the son of Pompey, and he used Marcus Lepidus' navy to go off and fight him. Now, but anyway, though, in the long run, what ends up happening as well, Lepidus gets all of his stuff taken from him because Octavian sees something on the horizon that's freaking him out a little bit. Mark Antony, his wife had recently died. His wife's name was Flavia and led a massive rebellion against Octavian. Why would Mark Antony's wife do this? Well, because Flavia thought that she was going to be able to curry some favor for Mark Antony and get him some more power, because the big thing about it in Rome, no one's ever accepting of their own power, right? It could have been fine. You could have just been chill and like, oh, you could have had a third and, you know, your husband could have had that area over in Greece. But also, Flavia leads this rebellion, and she ends up dying, which means Mark Antony is now single. Well, the thing about it is, Mark Antony goes and hooks up with a very powerful woman that we talked about today today in class. Isn't that right, Kelsey, right? Cleopatra herself, right? Mark Antony actually goes off, marries Cleopatra, and has 3 kids with her, right? Like, so has 3 children with this woman. And Octavian is getting freaked out. Because if you looked back at that map, Egypt was the only place that Rome did not own, right? And who owned it? Cleopatra, right? Cleopatra owned it, and it was considered the breadbasket of Rome. It's where they grew a ton of different grains and other supplies and stuff like that. So Mark Antony unites with Cleopatra, giving him a large enough military and a large enough army that freaks Octavian out, and Octavian decides to go to war with Mark Antony and Cleopatra. And at the Battle of Actium, Octavian beats Mark Antony and Cleopatra in a really big way. And he claims Egypt as his own, creating a new Rome that surrounds the entire Mediterranean. Now, when he actually beats them, the story goes that Mark Antony actually killed himself before Octavian could get to him and have him executed. And then Cleopatra was like, I cannot live my life without my man. And so apparently, according to the story, Mark Antony's dead and dying body was brought into the arms of Cleopatra, and Mark Antony died in her arms and stuff like that. And then what ends up happening is Cleopatra decides, I cannot live without him, and she reaches into a basket that has a cobra inside of it, and she thrusts it onto her chest and kills herself using a snake, right? Now, in real life, though, Mark Antony and Cleopatra were not actually nearby each other when they died, but we do believe that Cleopatra actually killed herself using a snake, which is absolutely wild, right? So Cleopatra was a very, very famous figure and a very, very major player in all this stuff, right? So we need to remember that. Now, the biggest thing about it, though, in general, is now that Octavian has beaten Mark Antony and Cleopatra in this entire kerfuffle, right? What ends up going down is Octavian becomes dictator in 27 BC, and he restores himself to what is known as the Republic, quote unquote. Now, here's where things get a little dicey, right? Octavian didn't really give power back to the Republic because he started the empire, right? Which means he is the very first true emperor. Notice I have Republic in quotes, right? Well, it's due to the fact that Octavian really never restored the empire back, right? He didn't actually do it. He just made all the Romans think he did it, right? And he changed his name to Augustus, which means respected one. What he actually created was a new system that he referred to as the Principate system, right? The Principate basically made Octavian a permanent consul, right? A consul that had overriding power over anything that the Republic could dish out, right? If the Senate brought out a law he didn't like, he could veto it. If the other consul tried to flex on him, he could veto it and have him taken off, right? He could do all these different things. The Principate, what it means, is the first citizen of Rome. So in the long run, the funny thing about it is Octavian never even called himself emperor. He actually referred to himself as imperator, the same title that's given to those famous generals that wore the purple togas, that had the big parades, that had a little boy whispering to him, remember, you're not a god, you're a man. That was the title he was given. But over time, when you say the word imperator, 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 imperator over and over and over again, it turned into the word emperor, right? And so eventually the Principate system evolved into what is known as the emperor. But the very first emperor of Rome is none other than Augustus, right? And he's an absolute genius in this process. He's phenomenally intelligent in all this process. Like, he saw Mark Antony allying with Cleopatra, realizing it could be a threat. He saw that Lepidus was weak, took the navy from him and stuff like that. He defeated Pompey's son in, like, battle and stuff like that. The dude is wicked smart, right? And he also had already killed off 30% of the Senate, so the other 2/3 of him were loyal to him out of fear, right? Like, so, because, like, what happened to the other third of the Senate? Oh, they're all dead now. Well, the thing about it, though, is Augustus ain't no dummy. And he ushered in to time what is known as this thing called the Pax Romana, right? Now, here's the interesting thing about Augustus. He's a very morally disputed figure because he, like, killed 30% of the senatorial families, but he also started a period of time of 200 straight years where Rome didn't fight itself anymore and there were no civil wars, right? This era is known as the Pax Romana, or Roman peace. This 200-year-long period of time where Romans went out and took over things and fought barbarians, but didn't fight civil wars against themselves, is known as that period of Roman peace, and it's considered a golden age, right? And so the Pax Romana is defined by periods of great, tremendous growth under the first true emperor known as Augustus, and up until the last emperor of the Pax Romana, Marcus Aurelius, right, which we'll talk about in class tomorrow. Now, under the Principate and the Imperator system, Augustus was able to do a lot of different things. He accomplished a bunch of different stuff, including the fact that he created basically a constitutional monarchy, which is going to become an enduring concept throughout all of Europe later on, even after Rome falls. The idea that a king or a leader is subject to laws just like other people are as well. When a king has to work with other governing bodies. Because in the Principate system, even though Augustus was imperator, he still had to talk to the Senate. He still had to work with them. He still had to work with the other consul, and he still had to make sure that the empire was efficiently ran. So he basically created a constitutional monarchy just without a constitution, right? Because the Romans didn't have one of those. So the other big thing about it, though, is he passed laws giving citizens more rights and extended citizenship to more people, allowing more people to vote. He also made it so that the Romans were the very first group of people ever to take this thing known as a census, which is a count of everybody in the entire empire, so you know how much they own, how many people live there, and so you can create an efficient taxation system, right? So that census was under Augustus, and it's super, super important, and it's the very first efficient one. The Romans had done censuses before, but this one was highly efficient, right? Also, the roads and infrastructure system is going to be expanded. New government buildings get built under Augustus, and he also even expanded the aqueduct system, which we'll talk a lot about that in class tomorrow. It's a system of fresh water arrival to the city of Rome, right? Now, it's very important that you understand what that is, but we'll bring that up in class tomorrow so you can understand it a little bit better. He also created a very important thing as well, the very first professional army. An army that is not taken advantage of, an army that is not given money until 10 years later. He wanted to avoid the veteran problem by making working in the army a paid position. What a genius, right? He solved the entire problem that Julius had to deal with by just paying soldiers and being like, oh, your job is now no longer a farmer, you're a soldier in our army. So, of course, the armies grew to be absolutely massive, and Rome is going to expand to an absolute height that no one had ever seen before, right? To this ridiculous size that literally is going to just boggle the minds of people going forward. That's because of Augustus's famous professional army. Hold on one second. Sorry about that. Jumped back to the front of the Prezi. Had to get all the way back. But he also created another thing as well, known as the Praetorian Guards, which is a big thing as well because it's actually, they're going to dictate the power progression of a lot of different people. What the Praetorian Guards are, it's basically the secret service for the emperor, right? They're a specific group of soldiers that actually guarded the emperor and kept them safe. And they were very well known for wearing purple togas and stuff like that because they were supposed to be guardians of the most royal individual, the imperator, right? So the thing about it is, though, later on, and tomorrow, we're going to start talking about a lot of this different stuff, like this thing that was built during the Pax Romana. So I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.